everyone. Welcome to another episode of our Azure Live series. I hope you had a wonderful weekend and you are happy to join us. And we promise you this is going to be an exciting session. So, Sir David, I hope you are looking forward to this session as well.
There's only one person that should be called sir in this conversation. That's that's not me. That's my sir from all the way from Oxford and by the way of Ghana. So you're the one that should be called sir. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing so
I
well.
can say you have a nice haircut. Your hair is looking a
Well,
bit.
it's
Yeah.
getting to the summer, so I have to do. Yes. All
Awesome.
right. So,
Awesome.
what do you
Yeah.
have for us today, Sir David?
Oh, okay. So, first thing, let me bring up my screen. So, one of the first things is that just to encourage people that if you're yet to join our meetup group, make sure that you go to join our meetup group. So, that is rebrand.ly/Azure Set Meetup. And also, we have all our other social media channels like YouTube and Twitch. So, the recordings of the sessions and the labs that we're going to be doing. So Sakofi has some very interesting things for you on the lab. So all the recordings will be posted on our social media. So do make sure that you follow that. So in terms of what we're going to be looking at today. So today is all about identity Sakofi. So what we said we're going to look at, let's go to the course outline, was we're going to cover the entire objectives of the Azure Administrator certification. And last week we did the introduction, looking at Azure infrastructure. So today we're going to be looking at identity. So, and after that, we're going to look at the other topics that makes up the Azure Administrator certification. And also just to remind people that we have this live study schedule. So today we're doing identity, but we have other modules that we're going to be covering or other topics that we're going to be covering. So governance and compliance, part one tomorrow, and then part two next tomorrow. And then every Monday and Tuesday evening, we're going to be covering the other objectives, and we'll do an exam preparation session finally on the 14th of June. So that's the plan, Sir Kofi.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it
looks
looks like it's action packed and it's back to back in most of these. So I do believe our audience are noting this down and they'll be joining us on most of these sessions. So we're definitely looking forward to it.
yeah, that would definitely be awesome. So if I go to like what the objectives are for today, and I'm going to bring that up. So the objectives that we have for today are, because we're talking about identity, we're going to be looking at Azure Active Directory. We're going to be looking at users, devices, and groups in Azure AD. And we're going to look at multiple Azure AD tenants. And at the end of this, Sarkofi has some very interesting treat for you
That's right.
on some nice homework. So Sarkofi, yeah, so you've got something for the people.
Yeah. So after this session, we will try to get you to have a bit of practice yourself on how you can actually achieve what we will run through. So, I mean, stay tuned. You definitely be excited with the labs that we have for you today.
Awesome. Okay, so let's start first of all with Azure Active Directory. So, Sarkofi, I'm going to be putting you on the spot a lot today, but you can handle it. You're a giant. You're a giant in this industry. you're, you're a popular giant in this industry, so I'm going to be putting you on the spot. So, Azure Active Directory, when people hear that, a lot of people that I see thinks in Active Directory. So, from your own understanding at the moment, so what is Azure Active Directory? What does it even mean? What does it do? What benefits do I get from using this service?
All right. When we say Azure Active Directory, I mean, for everyone, I think the first thing that will come to your mind will be the on-prem Active Directory. So in my mind, I would think it probably behave the same way, but I believe that that is definitely not the case. So, for what I see as an Azure Active Directory, it's more like another service on the cloud environment that hosts things like the username and group and devices that uh, people can actually, if they want to get access to certain resources, they can use that one as the authentication service to authenticate them to give them access or authorization to, obviously look at certain resources on the Azure platform.
Awesome. That's awesome. So, Sir Kofi, some feedback coming from the chat. So, a lot of people are saying that your sound is very low. So, I'm not sure if there's a way for us to switch that up a bit.
Okay.
So, people are just
I
bringing that
think,
up in
yeah,
the.
I'll speak a bit louder. Is it?
Yeah. So, hopefully, that's better for everyone out there. So, yes, Sir Kofi, I think that's an amazing answer that you gave. So, let's see. So, in terms of what Azure AD is, let's go have a quick look at this. So, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at Azure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory concept. We'll look at the difference between on-prem AD and Azure AD. We look at Azure AD editions. But from my understanding, Sir Kofi, in
Yeah.
order for people to understand Azure Active Directory, people need to understand what Azure Active Directory is not. Because you brought up a very important point. People that know on-premises Active Directory, it's very easy to confuse it with Azure Active Directory. And do you know who I blame for this, Sakofi? Do you know who I blame for
I
this?
think it's probably the naming scheme is the first thing that will give it out because, as the naming implies, if you say Active Directory, it just clearly indicate that it's similar to what we have on prem.
Exactly. It's Microsoft's fault. Exactly. Because why would you? But I think it's like a branding thing. I think Microsoft wanted to keep the brand name of Active Directory and they called this service Azure Active Directory. Whereas this service has very little relationship when it comes to the way that it functions and the way that on premises Active Directory functions. So
So,
they're different.
so
Yeah.
what you're saying is that it's different. Does it have certain features like, let's say, LDAP, NTLM, or Kerberos, like we have on prem, or
Good question.
different? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. No, so the answer to that is it does not. It does not have any of that stuff. Actually, the first thing that we wanted to talk about is Azure AD is not on premises Active Directory in Azure. So, which is like the first point, right? It's not on prem Active Directory in Azure. It has nothing to do with on prem Active Directory in Azure. They work differently. And the question then is if it is not on prem Active Directory in Azure, what is it then? So, Azure AD, one of the definition is that is the identity provider for Microsoft Cloud Services. Right. But if you think about that definition is not clear. What does it mean by identity provider for Microsoft services? So here's what we mean by that. If you go to sign up for a Microsoft Cloud service today, so you go to sign up for an Azure subscription, or you go to sign up for an Office 365 subscription. When you do that, transparently in the background, it's going to create an Azure AD tenant for you. So what happens is that the users, the groups, the service principals that will be accessing your Microsoft Cloud services like your Azure resources and your Office 365 resources, those identities are going to be stored in Azure AD. Your actual application and the resources exist in these other subscriptions over there. So that is what we mean when we say Azure AD is the identity provider for Microsoft Cloud services. It means
All
that
right.
sorry.
All right. So wait. So, uh, I cannot have. So each time I create a subscription, automatically it create an AD. What about if I do not want an AD, or you cannot do without it?
Awesome. That's a very nice question, Sir Kofi. So it's sort of like you have to have an Azure AD tenant when you go to sign up for a Microsoft Cloud service. So there's no way around that.
Okay.
So
What about the other way around? Can I have an Azure AD without a subscription?
very good question also. So the answer to that is yes, it's possible. So you can go create an Azure AD tenant. Actually, the way that many organizations would do this, here's what they will do, Sir Kofi. They will go to sign up for an Azure AD tenant first. And then after that, they'll begin to sign up for Microsoft Cloud Services with the account that they already created in the Azure AD tenant. And the reason for that is, so I have my Azure AD tenant first of all. It's not linked to any cloud service. Then I go to sign up for Office 365, and now it's linked to this Azure AD tenant. I can then go to sign up for an Azure subscription, and it's linked to this Azure AD tenant. I can go to sign up for another Azure subscription, and it's linked to this Azure AD tenant. So instead of having something like this, where I have multiple Azure AD tenants, 1, 2, and 3, I just sign up for one to begin with, and I use that one to sign up for the other services that I'm using so that I only need one trusted identity source.
Okay. So is there any limit to how many subscription I can link to one AD?
Oh, very, very good question. Not that I'm aware of. So not that I'm aware of. So there probably may be a limit, but I'm not aware of that limit now. So,
Okay.
but yeah, but I think that it's such that because if an organization like Microsoft are driving towards having a single Azure AD tenant for their entire organization, so that's what Microsoft are driving towards. You can imagine how many Azure subscriptions that Microsoft has as an organization,
Yeah.
right? So I'll say the limit, if there's a limit, it's probably going to be a very, very sizable one.
Okay, so looking at your diagram you have there, it looks like we have subscription and services being linked to the AD. So what about the other way around? Can the other service or subscription to be can they be linked to multiple ADs?
Oh, very, very good question. So we have a slide that we'll get to later
Okay, okay, okay,
where that's going to be covered more. Yeah. So we're going to get to it. So just a teaser for people, we're going to get to a slide where we're going to cover, okay, can I have multiple Azure AD tenants? And, how many Azure AD tenants can I link a subscription to? And that. So we have a nice slide for that.
okay. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, the problems. Awesome. So then we mentioned here, so let me clear the screen for all the diagrams and everything. So the way that it works is that Azure subscription and Office 365 will redirect user to Azure AD for authentication. So let's say a user goes to the Azure portal, right, to access your Azure resources through the Azure portal. When the user goes to the Azure portal, the user will be redirected transparently to Azure AD that will authenticate the user. Azure AD will authenticate the user and give the user's client, maybe that's the user's web browser, will give the user's client something called an access token. And then the access token can then be used to access that service. So let me show this to you very quickly, Sarkofi. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's go to the environment. I just want you to look at so what I'll do here is I'll go to actually go close that completely, and I'll go to open a web browser I'm going to be using. So let's go to do this. So let's go to bring up a new private web browser. And Sarkofi, what I want you to pay attention to is look at the address bar when I type this in. So when I type in portal.azure.com, I want you to see what will happen in the address bar, right? So if I press enter, what you'll see is that it's going to change from portal.azure.com and it's going to redirect me to login.microsoftonline.com. Login.microsoftonline.com, that's Azure AD. That is the Azure portal redirecting you to Azure AD to say, go talk to that guy over there. That's the guy over there that's going to, or the girl over there, that's the one that's going to authenticate you. If Azure AD were to be a male or a female. So that's the service over there that's going to authenticate you. Bless you. So if I go to portal.azure.com, so watch that. Can you see that? It's redirected me. So now I'm talking to Azure AD. So then I go to put in my credentials to authenticate to this service. So if I go to bring in my credentials very quickly. So I've got some credential over here. I just need to copy it and paste it. Here we go. So copy my username and click OK, and then put in my password. So let's go copy that and put in my password. And if I click sign in, so now it's going to redirect me back to portal.azure.com with the access token. Yeah. So that's what's happening in the back end. So that's how they all work together.
The whole kind of like process of the access token.
Exactly. Right. And in this particular study series, we're not going into details with the access token and OAuth authentication and how it works. However, we plan to extend this, right, Sarkofi? We're not just going to be doing Azure Administrator series. We're going to do the Azure Developer series. We're going to do the Azure AI Engineer series, the Azure IoT series. When we get to the Azure Developer series, we'll get into this in even more details.
Okay. So just looking at the image you have on the screen, it looks like you have an AD subscription to Azure AD, and below it is Office 365 subscription to Azure AD. So this means that the Azure AD is not just authentication or identity broker for just Azure subscription, but also for Office 365 subscription.
That's exactly so. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why I call Sarkofi Sir. Who can describe it? Who else? I challenge you out there. Who else can describe it as clearly as Sarkofi just did right now? right? so,
That's true.
so that's why I call him the star. So now you understand. So yeah, so that's exactly right, Sakofi. So that's exactly the way it works and how it functions. So let's go back. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. So we said Azure AD is the identity provider for Microsoft Cloud Services. So that's your Office 365, your Dynamics 365, your Azure subscriptions. So the other thing about Azure AD is that Azure AD implements modern authentication protocols.
So what does it mean by modern authentication? I know NTLM Kerberos are kind of outdated. So what do you mean by modern? What is classified as modern?
Very, very good question, Takofi. So to answer that, what I'll do is I'll go to the next slide. And let's go back in history lesson. All right, let's take some history lesson. So it's like Sakofi, you mentioned NTLM. We also have another older or legacy authentication protocols called Kerberos. Do you know what year like this protocol Kerberos was invented? By the way, I don't have any idea. Also, just so you know.
No,
But if we go to Kerberos and we go to check out a bit of history lesson on Kerberos and to see where Kerberos was invented. So, by the way, the name Kerberos it's from like a Greek mythology, right? It's like a three-headed dog that guards the gate of hell of AIDS. So it's like Greek mythology that converted. But Kerberos itself, if you go to have a look, so stable release, so that's like the latest release. So let's go have a look at the history and see. So Kerberos version 4 was primarily designed by Steve Miller and Clifford Newman, published in the late 1980s. So if you look at that, Sakofi, so we're talking about a protocol that was published in the late 1980s. Has there been any changes in the computing world in 1980s and the computing world today?
a lot of changes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the network that they were dealing with at that time is not the network that we're dealing with at this time. So what I'm saying is that these protocols, NTLM and Kerberos, they were designed at a time when everything lived on the same network. You have your application server living on your network. Your applications are hosted on this application server. They're living happily. You have your authentication provider on the same network. Then you're using authentication protocols like NTLM and Kerberos. And if you have a look, so for example, here's a list of all the ports that you need to have open for Kerberos to work, Sakofi. I mean, look at that. Look at that. You have to open this port for this to work. Now, if I come to you, Sakofi, you're the security admin, and I tell you, Sakofi, I want to be able to authenticate an application outside my network. I need you to open this to the internet. What would you say to me if you're the security admin?
That's a huge flaw because I mean the first all the known ports will be open, and even from 32,000 to 65,000 ports will also be open, which is quite a lot.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
attackers can take advantage of these.
Exactly. So that is the reason why these protocols, it's not as if they are bad. So they are good protocols for the time that they were designed for. However, times have moved on. So that is the reason why these protocols will be considered to be legacy authentication protocols. In the modern world that we live in, Sir Kofi, a lot of our applications are now cloud-based applications. The SaaS application, software as a service application, which are applications that lives in someone else's network, and applications that most of the application components are not even under our control. So what that means is that legacy authentication protocols no longer fit our requirements. So what I'm trying to explain is this is the reason why we needed new authentication protocols. We needed new authentication protocols because our legacy authentication protocols no longer fit our current environment in how we operate. So what does those modern authentication protocols look like? That was Sarkoph's question. So here's what they look like. So the most common ones are SAML version 2, OpenID Connect, WS-Fed, so which is like Microsoft, Yeah, so thanks very much. I think we got somebody answering and saying OpenID and OAuth. So we have OpenID and OAuth, but we also have SAML, we have WS-Fed. So Of all these authentication protocols, one thing is common. So they work a bit differently, but one thing is common among all of them. They operate over the web transport. And by web transport, we mean HTTP, HTTPS. So what that means is I can pass authentication token like we just did with Azure over HTTP, HTTPS. I can redirect you to an HTTPS server, you do authentication, you obtain a token, you pass it back using HTTPS. So everything functions over web transport, which means you don't need to open all of these ports and everything. As long as you have port 443 open, modern authentication protocols most likely will work. Does that make a bit of sense, Akofi?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this will minimize any security risk because all websites, all of them run over either 80 or 443. So if the authentication runs on the same protocol, then I think this will be much better compared to the legacy ones.
Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. So let's see. So now that we understand that, so we say Azure AD is the identity provider for Microsoft Cloud Services. It also implements modern authentication protocol. What else can we learn about Azure AD? So here's the primary use case of Azure AD. The primary use case is as the identity provider for applications that support modern authentication protocols.
But
So in other, yeah,
what if that specific application do not support the modern authentication protocol?
you can't use Azure AD because it's like we don't speak the same language, right? It's like,
Okay.
oh, okay, I speak Kerberos. However, there are some
What
ways.
about
Yeah.
one-time password?
Oh no, one-time password is something different, right? Because that one is it's still using an authentication protocol in the backend. It's just surfacing it with a pin that you can use instead of doing that. So it's still going to be using an authentication protocol actually, like in the backend.
So in conjunction with some other modern authentication, it can be a standalone in terms of one-time password.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So here's one thing though. So to answer your question, you said, what if an application does not support modern authentication protocols and stuff? So what Microsoft did is like a little bit of like it's like a little bit of like cheating, and but it's not cheating. It's like a nice piece of technology. So you have Azure AD over here. Yeah, you have Azure AD. And what happens is you have an application over here that only speak Kerberos and NTLM. So this application only speaks Kerberos and NTLM. We'll call it KNN. What you can do is you can go to implement another service in Azure. Get ready for this, Kofi, to add extra confusion by Microsoft. You can go implement another service called Azure ADDS. And Azure ADDS is different from Azure AD, is different from on-prem AD. Thanks very much for the confusion, Microsoft. So what Azure ADDS will do is that it will synchronize your objects from Azure AD,
Yeah.
synchronize them to itself, and then it runs Kerberos and NTLM. So
Okay.
this runs Kerberos and NTLM. So essentially, all you need to do is manage your identity in Azure AD. They will automatically be synchronized to this, and this supports legacy authentication protocols that this can use. So
Okay. So
that way,
like a middle broker.
exactly.
Understood.
So yeah, and actually, this is just running Active Directory in the backend, but the difference is you don't have to manage the server. So it's a managed service. So, and if you wanted to implement that, if I go to the Azure portal very quickly here to show that, if I go to create a resource, let's make this screen a bit larger. If I go to create a resource and come on, so create a resource. Sometimes you have to type correctly. So Azure AD domain services. There we go. So this is Azure AD domain service. So I want to implement amount of minutes to finish creating. This service is going to do is that you can see that it supports end-to-end Kerberos authentication, right?
Yeah.
It supports domain join, it supports LDAP, right? So what it's going to do is that it's going to synchronize your identity from Azure. So if I go to create this, I won't create it, but I just want to show you what it looks like.
Right.
So
Just
it's going to, yeah,
so you mentioned it's synchronized. So
yeah.
is it going to move the password across to this service from the on-prem
Yes.
service? And
Yeah.
is it going to encrypt it or hash it, or what's going to happen to the password when it's encrypted?
Yes, it's going to use the same hashing mechanism that on-premises AD uses. So actually,
Is
this
it
is
reversible then? Is it
no. So
reversibly engineered?
yeah, no, it's going to be like it's just going to be a salted hash is what it's going to use in the backend. So, but remember that even if you have like salted hashed password, so people do build databases of salted hashes. So even though they are not technically reversible, people it's like you do just multiple calculation of things. You get not salted hashes, but you get the same hash back if you're not using like any salt. So, which is why a lot of technologies try to randomize the salts that they use to make sure
Okay.
that the end result is different all the time and stuff.
And I
So
believe there's a security angle here as well, whereby if Microsoft, obviously, they scan a dark web for, I mean, any kind of hashes, and then if they find out that that specific hash has been leaked, then it's easier for them to know that there has been, I mean, your password probably is in the Wild West or something that you
yeah.
can also protect it once you're aware of it.
So the capability that you're talking about is something called Azure AD Identity Protection.
Yeah.
So that is available in Azure AD Premium Edition, which we'll talk about that in
Okay.
one of the slides today. Yeah. Awesome. So now that this makes sense to us, so let's go have a look at quick difference between Azure AD and on-prem AD. So Azure AD is queried over HTTP, HTTPS over REST API. So the API endpoint of Azure AD is something called Microsoft Graph. So if you've ever read any Microsoft documentation and they talk about Microsoft Graph is a lot of things, right? It goes beyond Azure AD. But one of the things that it does is that it's sort of like the API endpoint for Azure AD if you want to query it. On-prem AD, we query that over LDAP. Um, Azure AD, of course, we talked about that, uses modern authentication protocols and then OAuth is an authorization framework, not Kerberos, that on-premises AD uses. On-premises AD, we have this hierarchical structure. We have organization units. So we have the root, then we have organization unit, and then we can have organization units inside organization unit. And whenever you want to query an item, you have to specify all those paths. Azure AD doesn't deal with any of that stuff. It's a flat structure. It's like I don't store things the same way. On-prem AD, you have group policy that you can use to manage the configuration of like your user object and your device identities. On-prem AD, Azure AD doesn't deal with any of that stuff. So it doesn't do organization units. It does
Right.
not do GPOs. So Azure AD includes native federation services. So this one will make sense later on. So because normally on-prem AD, if you want to do federation, you have to go set up another service called ADFS. And we have like an ADFS champion in like our study groups at Kofi. So if you know, remember Taiwo?
Yeah.
Taiwo's an ADFS champion. So Taiwo will tell you that ADFS is not an easy service to manage. So ADFS is a very complex service. But Azure AD doesn't need ADFS to do federation. So it just simplifies federation. So Sarkophagi, so this is to the one you were talking about. So Azure AD, we have different editions. We have four main editions of Azure AD. We have the free edition, Office 365 edition, Premium P1 edition, Premium P2 edition. The question then is, what is the significance of this edition? So the edition that we'll select determines the features of Azure AD that we can use. So Sarkophagi asked the question earlier about a feature called identity protection. So you can only use that feature, for example, if you have Premium P2 edition. If you're on Premium P1 edition, you can't use that particular feature. So you have to have the right edition for the feature that you want to use and that you want to. I tell you like a little bit of story. So I was telling my wife Sakofi earlier. I said I ordered like some chin chin online, very very cheap chin chin. It's like for like 80p for like a whole big box, right? Sakofi, do you know what chin chin is?
No.
No, you know what Chin Chin is? I'm going to visit Ghana. I told you already, I'm going to visit Ghana. And we're definitely going like after the whole pandemic stuff is over.
Yeah.
Chin Chin is one of these popular snacks in like the side of Nigeria that I'm from. So where it's like a fried type of snack. So, and then I ordered like very, very cheap one online and I was enjoying my Chin Chin, cheap one. But then one time, I ordered like an expensive one that was like about £8 for like a small pack of chin chin, right? And I got that, and I was like, "What's in this thing that's like almost 8 times more expensive than the other one?" And Sakofi, I tell you, I put this in my mouth, and I was like, "Oh my god!" And
Really?
guess what? I have my other big box of chin chin, and I can't go back to it anymore. I'm like, anytime I put it in my mouth, I'm like, what is this nonsense? So it's sort of like that way, right? So you get to start using some of the features of Azure AD Premium P2. Then you're like, what is this nonsense I had with the free edition? So, but if the free edition is the only one you have, that's what you have to begin with.
Yeah, you pay for what you I mean, wherever the value counts a lot. It's not like you can get something for free and expect to have all the bells and whistles, I guess.
Exactly. That's absolutely true. So I can see a question in the chat window. Someone says, what's the difference between editions? So let's see the difference between the editions. So very, very good question, by the way. So the Azure AD Free Edition is the edition that comes when we sign up for Azure subscription. We get the Azure AD Free edition. The Office 365 edition is the edition that we get when we sign up for Office 365. So that's the edition that we get with that. The Premium P1 edition and the Premium P2 editions are editions that we can buy and that we can buy for ourselves. So that's sort of like the way that works. So just to help people to understand this, so I'll go to the next slide and then I'll show you what the differences are. So if you have a look at this, for example, you see, so these are the features that are common across all of them. So they all, you can have objects, you can do single sign-on for all of them, but you can see that the single sign-on limit is different. So for example, for free, you can go up to 10 applications for single sign-on, but for premium, you can have unlimited number of applications, right? So, and then you can see features like password protection, self-service password change for cloud users, multi-factor authentication that's available to like all the editions. But let's go see the differences between the free and the Office 365 edition. So you can see that when it comes to doing branding, like your company branding, you want your company logo when users go to sign in. You want to be able to do self-service password reset for cloud users, right? You want an SLA from Microsoft, right? You have to be on at least Office 365 edition to get those. So free edition does not cover those. What's the difference? Yeah. So what's the difference between the Office 365 and the Premium P1 edition? So you can see that you want to have something called custom banned password. So this is where you can add a custom list of password that you want to ban in your organizations. If you want to use that feature, you need to be on minimum of Premium P1. If you want to use conditional access, so that's password protection, you want to use self-service password reset, and with on-premises write back, you need a minimum of Premium P1. You want to use get advanced report on user sign-in, you need Premium P1 edition. Dynamic groups that we'll talk about today, conditional access, multi-factor authentication with conditional access, you need Premium P1. Now, in order to, so Premium P2 is all about security and compliance. So that's what Premium P2 is about. So Premium P2, you can see also identity protection, which was the feature that Sakofi talked about. So that's only available for Premium P2. And then we have identity governance, where you can do advanced security capabilities like privileged identity management, access review to review on an ongoing basis who has access and if they still need that access. So essentially, Premium P2 is about security and governance, right? So Premium P1 is about more advanced capabilities, more advanced identity management capability. Premium P2 is about advanced security and governance. So that's the differences between them.
Now I understand your point that once you start using these services, you never go back.
Yeah.
Much how protection compared to the others.
Yep, exactly. Completely agree. So let's see. Let's move on and let's go to talk about other parts of this. So let's talk about users, devices, and groups in Azure AD. So what we're going to look at user account, managing user accounts, groups, devices, and we'll see how all of that works. So let's start with Azure AD users. So Sakofi, earlier we mentioned that when you create an Azure on a Microsoft Cloud service like Azure subscription, Office 365, you get an Azure AD tenant. Now, in order for a user to get management access to Azure resources, they need to have an account in Azure AD. So that's the way that that works. If I want to grant a user access over here, I need to first of all grant them, give and create an identity for them over here. So, for example, I want to specify somebody to be an owner of this subscription. Owner means you can do anything. Before I can do that, I have to go over to Azure AD and I have to go create a user account for you. But here's the question. What options do I have when I want to create users in Azure AD? First option is I can create a user directly in Azure AD. So this is where I go to the Azure portal, I go to Azure PowerShell, and I go to create a user. Guess what? I think I've just committed like a mini crime. I put Sir Kofi's name without the Sir in front of your name. I'm absolutely sorry about that. Sorry for doing that, sir. I should go change this. I should really go change that. But I'll fix it when I go to create your user account. So if I go over to my Azure AD over here, so let's go over here and I go to Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and I go to create a user account. If I already have a user account for you in this directory, I'll just go create one right now. Come on. The Azure portal had some issues this week, so it was down for some time this week. So it's probably still recovering from everything. So anyways, if I go to create a new user, and so this is what you call just direct creation. I'm creating a user. So this time around, I won't make the same mistake. Username, I'll be Sir Kofi. Exactly. That's the way it should be. And also the name, make sure that you always add the Sir. That's important. Right? And you get that. So yeah, it's going to be Sir Kofi's username. And I can just generate a temporary password for you, which I'll create one for you. And I'll get to the group in a minute. I'll just add location. I'll add United Kingdom. And I'll just go ahead and essentially I'll just put this, I'll say Lonier Investor. All right, so yeah, it's like, not many people will be honest to say that. So let's be honest. I'll just put that in a notepad document so I can go back to your username later. Bring up a notepad document, I'll put your username there. So Sakofi at Azure. So I just create a user account for you. So that's one option that we have when we're creating user identities. But that's not the only option. The other option that I have is that, let's say I have an on-premises Active Directory. Sakofi. So let's say I have an on-premises Active Directory. I already have my users there. I probably may not want to be creating everyone from scratch like I just did, right? So apart from our billionaire investor, because it's special. So what I can do then is I can synchronize identities from on-premises into Azure AD. To do that, we use a tool called Azure AD Connect, right? So that's the tool that we use. So it's a tool that we can install on our on-premises environment, and then we can use it to synchronize identities into Azure AD. So that's another option that we have. So I'll just erase that. So the other option is that in some cases, Sakofi, we are working with a third-party partner.
Yeah.
So maybe we have, maybe Sakofi has Sakofi Institute, David has David Institute, and we're collaborating on some research. And what we want to do in this case is I want certain users in your organization to be able to access some Azure resources in my organizations and manage them because we're collaborating together. What I can do is I can invite users from your Azure AD tenant. I can invite them as guests into my Azure AD tenant. So that's another option. So that's another way to get users into Azure AD. So you saw that earlier when I was creating Sakofi's account, I created new user, but I can also go to new guest user. So this is me saying I want to go bring a user from another Azure AD tenant into my organization AD. So then I can begin to give them access to my resources or to my services. But there's another option still. So the other option is to invite Microsoft accounts. So this one is a bit different, Sir Kofi. So this is where we have another confusion because when we say Microsoft account, what do you think? What comes to your mind when we say Microsoft account?
Probably Office 365, I guess.
You'll be close there. So the Microsoft account will probably be something. So initially, what people will probably think would be like your Outlook.com account,
Yeah.
right? Or your Hotmail account. But the truth is, a Microsoft account does not equals to an Outlook account or Hotmail account. A Microsoft account actually can be any email address
Oh, I see.
out there. So here's the thing key to understand that. So you have to separate a Microsoft account, I'll just call it MA, from an email address. So an email address is an email address. So anyone that has any email address can create a Microsoft account.
Okay, so any webmail.
Yes. So
Okay.
for example, right, I can invite my yahoo.com email address. And if I do that, what will happen is I will get an email in my Yahoo mailbox that's going to say, you've been invited to this Azure AD tenant.
Right.
However, you do not have a Microsoft account. So click on this link to create a Microsoft account for your email address. And when I create a Microsoft account for my email address, then essentially, then that's the account that is invited over there. So you have to separate account from email. So email is email, account is account.
So based on what you're describing here, you don't necessarily have to have a domain or AD. It can be literally any.
Any email, exactly. So you can literally invite anyone with any valid email into your Azure AD tenant. Of course, that may not be what you want to do, right? If you're as an organization, if you want to control that, what you can do is you can control that by going to under your Azure AD configuration. If you go to under user settings, you can go control that. So the way to control that is to go to external users and you go to manage that settings. And when you're managing that settings, you can, for example, control who can invite people into your organization. And also you can add restrictions on the domains that they can invite.
Right.
So you can add an allow list or you can add a block list, a deny list. So for example, I can say, allow people to be only be able to invite people with this domain, right? So partner.com or whatever other partner I'm working with, or I can say deny them from being able to invite anyone with this domain into my Azure AD tenant. So I can control that. But by default, you can invite anyone from with any email. Yeah. So that's how it works. Okay, so let's move on. So that is it for that. So one of the other things to understand when we talk about this is to understand the difference between member users and guest users. So member users are users that are considered to be native to an Azure AD tenant. The question is, what does it mean by that? You know, Sir Kofi, here's one thing about IT that sometimes can be frustrating. In IT, we have very fancy words that in some cases we seldom explain to people. Do you have you seen that before where someone comes up and just uses a bunch of fancy words and by
Yeah.
the time they finish saying what you're saying, you're like, I still have no clue what that means. Right? You're like, I just know like about 15 new words. And that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what we're trying to do with our service over here is to avoid that kind of stuff. So that's why we have this sort of engagement model between Sarkofi and myself. Otherwise, Sarkofi is busy sitting on his throne, right? But for her sake, is here to help to engage, right? To help to engage so that we're not just talking and just spouting off complex words that makes no sense to anyone. We're actually challenging each other and helping each other to actually help something to make sense. So a member user, we said a user that's native to Azure AD. What does that mean? For example, I created Sarkofi's account directly in Azure AD and I synchronized Emmy's account from on-prem AD. Those two users will be considered to be member users in Azure AD. In other words, they are native to that tenant, right? They are not invited from somewhere else. They belong to this tenant natively. And yeah. Sorry, Sarkofi, you wanted to say something?
No, I understand your point. So
Yeah,
anything that is invited we classify non-native.
exactly. And that's the point. Because over here, if I go to under users, you'll be able to see that. You see that some users will be listed as members, right? And depending on if I go to invite a user from outside, that user will be a guest user. So if I go to invite, somebody's email address, right? I just go to invite, let's call this user Dave.
Right.
And let's say,
we got a question. Let me just bring it up and then.
yes, please.
Right.
If
Question here. Can it be possible to use AD Connect on home lab?
Yes, it's possible. So if you want to do AD Connect in your home environment and your home lab, all you just need to do is, if you have an Azure subscription, spin up a virtual machine and spin up a virtual machine in Azure. Or what you can actually do is, if you go to the Azure Quick Start templates, you can simplify your life by just going to deploy an Azure HAM template that has Active Directory already installed. So just set up an Active Directory server, right? So that's what this is. So Azure Start template, let's go to the one on GitHub instead of that one. So, and there are a bunch of templates that exist. So one of the templates that exists is a template that we can use to create an Active Directory server in Azure. So just create an Active Directory server in Azure and then use that. But for some reason, I can't see it. It seems to be missing from this list. But anyways, that's how you do that. So I'll get the link later. Okay. So if the person has yet to join our group, so join our other group, and I can look for I'll look for that. Oh, here we go. So that's one. So create an Azure VM with a new AD Forest. So just use that template, and that template will allow you to deploy that, and then you can just use that to simulate what we're talking about. So let's put that in the chat window. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so let's move on very quickly. We got like 13 more minutes, so obviously we're not going to complete everything we wanted to complete, but the good thing is that people understand that. So Sarkofi, so that you got the point correctly. So guest users would be a user that's invited from other, whether it's a Microsoft account or a partner account. Okay. And stuff. Yeah. So that's about Azure AD users. Let's see some other useful information here. So let's just quickly talk about devices, and we'll talk about groups, and then I think that's probably where we'll probably have to stop today. So what about devices? So Azure AD is it's not just about users, it's also about devices. So we can bring devices and join them to our Azure AD environment. The question is, there are two questions here. Number one, why will I want to do that? Number two, what are the options that I have to do that? So number one, why will I want to do that? For two main reasons. There are multiple other reasons, but for two main reasons. Number one reason is you want to implement single sign-on to your cloud application. We said Azure AD can be the identity provider for your cloud services, right? Any service that supports modern authentication protocols. To simplify your single sign-on configuration. So for example, if a user just signs in to this computer with their Azure AD account, then once they've signed in, essentially they can just open a web browser, go to the URL of their SaaS application, and they don't need to sign in anymore, right? So that's one advantage. The other advantage that you may want to achieve is to do something called conditional access-based control. So this is where you're actually using information about this device to decide whether a user can have access or not. So for example, I can say, oh, sorry, Sarkofi, you wanted to say something.
Right, so with a conditional access, that means it have to be a specific license like Premium 1 or Premium 2.
Exactly, that's absolutely right, Sarkofi. So you have to have minimum of Premium P1 to be able to use conditional access. But if you have Premium P1 and then you have your devices joined, so one of the things that we can do is I can say, based on certain attribute of this device, I can use that to determine a condition that the user can use to access certain applications. So that is going to be covered again in much more details in maybe other things like the Azure Security Engineer series. So here we go. So here are the three options that we have. We have Azure AD joined devices, we have Azure AD registered devices, and we have hybrid Azure AD joined. So what's the difference between these and when would we use them? So first of all, Azure AD join. Azure AD join is what you use if the devices that we're talking about belongs to your organization. So my organization bought and paid for these devices for the users, right? So I want to be able to control those devices. So I can join them to my Azure AD tenant, and then I can implement policies for them and implement whatever control I want to implement for them. So the thing with this option also is that it's limited. You can only join Windows 10 devices and Windows Server 2019 virtual machines that are running on Azure to Azure AD. So those are the only options I support, unfortunately. So, but the good thing is that once you've joined that device to Azure AD, the user, in order to be able to sign into the device, have to sign in with their Azure AD account. So again, it just simplifies your single sign-on and everything like that. So that's how that works. The Azure AD registered option. So this is for bring your own device scenario. So Sir Kofi, being the billionaire that he is, he's got a whole bunch of Mac devices, a bunch. He doesn't use like the normal Macs that we all use. He probably has like the latest version of the Mac and everything. So Sir Kofi and Sir Kofi's fancy devices, the way that these billionaire investors work, right? You go to them and you say, Sir Kofi, we're thinking of giving you like this little Windows Surface laptop. It's like, no, I got my own PC here. It's got gold plated stuff. Like, oh, service, yeah. Can I use that? Yeah, sir, Kofi, you can use that. So that's for this scenario. So where people can use their own devices instead of an organization-owned devices. So in those scenarios, Sir Kofi may not want us to join his old system to an Active Directory tenant, right? Essentially, but what you can do is that you can register your device by yourself to the Azure AD tenant, and then it will allow you to do certain SSO capabilities. We can still do conditional access-based policies. But with this one, you're not signing in with organization AD account, so that is wrong information over there. So apologies for that. You're signing in with your user account. So either with a local user account, or you're signing in with your Microsoft account into your device, but the device is registered in Azure AD.
All right.
Then we have the hybrid Azure AD join. So this scenario is mainly for, let's say you have a mixture of Windows 10, Windows 8.1, Windows 7, those legacy Windows systems in your environment. So this ones, you can join them to your on-premises AD, right? So what you can do is you can join them to your on-premises AD. So you can see here, they are joined to on-premises Active Directory. However, you can also register them to Azure AD. So that's why it's called hybrid. So the advantage of this is you can still manage them on premises. They still log in with their on-premises Active Directory onto those systems, right? You can still do group policy management and all that stuff. However, they can also do single sign-on to cloud applications because the device is also registered in Azure AD. So those are the three options that we have when we talk about devices. And finally, let's talk about groups. So when we talk about groups in Azure AD, groups play the same role that groups play in any other system. And what is the role of a group? To make it easier for us to manage permissions. That's the role of a group. So instead of me going to say, I'm going to be assigning permission to Sir Kofi over here. So Sir Kofi has a young prince, Akwasi. So I'm going to go add another permission for Akwasi and all that stuff. So instead of me having to do all of that stuff, what I can do is I can group Sir Kofi and Akwasi and say, billionaire investors, right? Billionaire investors group, assign the permission one, it's all done. Everybody has permission. So that's what we're talking about here. So for example, I can go create a group called Cloud Architects Group, and then I can go to my Azure subscription and make that group a owner. So now if I want to assign permission, all I need to do is make sure I add you into this group. So if I go to add these users into this group, they automatically get those permissions. So there are two types of groups in Azure AD. There are security groups and Microsoft 365 groups. So when you're creating the group, you have to select one of the options. Security, yeah. Service, yeah. So what's the question again, Sir Kofi?
I was just going to ask, what is the difference between the two?
Oh, okay. It's a good question. So security groups are the groups that you typically use when you want to add access. Microsoft 365 group are like your distribution groups on premises, which are groups that are used for collaboration. So this group has an email address, right? It has a shared mailbox. You can send an email to that group and it goes to everyone in that group. So that kind of stuff. So this is what you use for collaboration. Why this is what you use for access, right? You just want to grant access. You don't need to be, doing collaboration and having email addresses and all that stuff. So you use security groups. So that's the main difference between them. But there are three assignment types. So we have assigned, dynamic user, and dynamic devices. So I'll just quickly talk about this and then we'll stop for today. So assigned, what do we mean by assigned? Let me clear up the screen very quickly. So assigned group membership. So this is where we directly add users into the group. So for example, I create a group called Cloud Architects and I had Brenda, David, and Emmy into that group. So that's assigned membership. So that is why if I go to the Azure portal over here, I go to my Azure environment. So if I go to under directory users, I can just go to create a new group under groups. And this is called direct assignment, what I'm about to do. So new group, and I can go put in a group information. Come on. There we go. So I select the security group, give it the name of Cloud Architect, a group description. So I already used that. So let's call this group Cloud Architect 10. So, and then membership type assigned. So what that means is I have to go add those members by myself. So this is assigned membership, right? So that is assigned. So, but then there are other options that exist. We have dynamic user and dynamic device. Dynamic user is what we'll do when we want to use a query to add members to the group. So that's why it's dynamic. So for example, here's a sample query. I can add a query that says if a user's department equals sales or a user's department equals marketing, automatically add them to this group. And what that means is that it's dynamic. So if HR modifies the department of Brenda, for example, that automatically is going to reflect, because the next time that this is calculated is going to go, Brenda's department is no longer marketing, therefore I'm going to remove Brenda from this group, right? Or David's department is no longer sales, therefore I'm going to remove David from this group. So it's dynamic. We specify the membership based on a query rather than directly adding them.
All right.
Yeah. But we do this using properties of a user account. So devices is the other side of that. So we have a group for devices and we can specify parameters of a group. Parameters of a device to add them to the group. So for example, I can say if the operating system type is equals to Windows or the device manufacturer type equals to Samsung, I want you to automatically add them into this group of Samsung devices, right?
Okay. All right. So David, we got a question here.
Yes.
I'm going to throw it on the screen and then
Yes, please.
yeah.
So let's see the question. So I can see Justin as P1 and P2 Azure AD will handle dynamic membership. Yes, absolutely yes. So if I go back to the slide that we had earlier, so in order for you to do dynamic membership, you do indeed need to have Azure AD Premium P1 or Azure AD Premium P2. You cannot do dynamic membership. So do you see that over here, Sakofi? You see that I cannot even change this, right?
Yeah.
The reason for that is because I'm not currently on dynamic P1, P1 or P2. So that's the reason for that. So hopefully that answers your question. So Sakofi, I'll stop right there. But Sakofi, you do have some special announcement for people today. So if I bring up on the screen, so what are people going to be doing after this session?
Right. So once again, thank you guys for joining this episode of our ongoing series. So just to engage you guys with what we've been talking about in this session, we have created a lab that we hope that you guys can follow to more like follow with what exactly we've been doing to obviously drive the message home. So David just wrote the slides and then we can walk you through
Yeah.
what we have.
So I'll bring that up on the screen.
Okay, so for this lab, it's all about creation of the user and the group, as we've already discussed in this episode. So the first information is all about the equipment that you need. That you just need any computer essentially that have a browser, and that should do the job. And these are, yeah, there you go. So you need the Linux or Mac or Windows, and these are the services that you need. So for us, you have PowerPoint or access to a CLI, whether on Linux or using the Azure CLI, and also Chrome browser for the portal access. That's all we need. Right. So you can move to the next one.
Yep. So let's go next.
Right.
Okay.
So these are the objective of this first lab, essentially. So the first one is to create and configure the Azure AD users. Right. Then after, I mean, you just do exactly what David demonstrated in this session, and then after, you will create the AD group with a sign and dynamic membership, like we demonstrated as well. And the video will also have a walkthrough that will help you to handle these tasks. The third option is to create Azure Active Directory AD tenant, and that also we've gone through that. And we have the last one, I believe, which is the manager on Azure AD guest users. And yeah, that's it. That's
Yeah.
what we
So
got.
that's it. So the instructions that we're actually using are coffee. So I'll also put that
Yes.
in the chat window. So the instructions are actually created by Microsoft themselves, by Microsoft Learning, and the instructions are all available on GitHub. So that's what we are leveraging. Why it needs to reinvent the wheel. But what we've now done is we've recorded a video of ourselves doing the lab. So we've put the video link this instruction. You can follow that, and we've also put the instruction there. So also we'll add that to the description of this video. So if you're just watching the recording, just look at the description of this video, and you see the link to the lab. So you're going to be doing lab number 1 in this case, and if you need any guidance, we have a video that you can follow.
All right.
Yeah. So, Sakofi, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us today. We
Yeah.
always appreciate you. So, this guy, for people that may not know, this guy has a gold farm in Ghana,
Good
right?
job.
It's not on my level. It's like a different class. So, I really appreciate you doing this. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely a pleasure. I mean,
yeah,
joining this session,
yeah.
and I believe our audience are also. I mean, they are asking questions, so I believe they are enjoying it and also taking something home, something they can take at work, something that will help them in the exams that they probably will take. So, thank you guys for joining this session, and I believe we do have one tomorrow. We
Yeah.
believe that you guys will join us on that one as well. We will be grateful if you do so. All right. Thank you guys and have a wonderful the rest of the week, our weekend. Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye bye.